Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'd like to thank Thomas for that very nice introduction and Martin Barry for organizing this extraordinary event. This event is in Prague, but I think it has international significance that you've been able to achieve in a very short amount of time, Martin, so well done. I want to take the time that I have to talk about the importance of public space and the idea of public space in the shared city. The city as a sort of venue that as people we all share, and what it means to design spaces that are not only beautiful and not only have aesthetic properties, but also do many, many other things. Ecological things in terms of water and air quality, or economic things in terms of adding economic development value, social things in terms of improving life and equity in the city. So there's a number of reasons why this topic, the shared city, is very important, and what I want to try to speak about is the importance of design and creativity in terms of contributing to that role. Now, of course, in Prague, some of what I'm going to talk about may seem a bit unusual or extraordinary because, of course, Prague is an excellent, beautiful city. Parks and gardens and public spaces are totally integrated with the fabric of the city. The streets, the courtyards, the squares, the piazzas, the waterfront, very small gardens all the way up to some fairly sizable parks, big chunks of nature actually embedded in the city. So Prague is an extraordinary example of a good city, but there are many, many other cities around the world facing a whole slate of challenges that maybe aren't so prevalent here. And related to the sort of romance or the sentimentality or the beauty of Prague, one can also think of landscape in these terms too. And this is a painting of a landscape by John Constable. It's the origins of landscape as something cultural, that is nature, sky, water, vegetation, topography, beautiful scenic places typically associated with countryside. But now, taking a much more fundamental, formative role in the conception and the creation, and the geometry and the spatialization and the programming of cities. This isn't particularly new. Frederick Law Olmsted, the famous landscape architect in the United States, many of his parks, while beautiful and pastoral, were also targeted around themes of water management, maintaining water quality and air quality in the city, as well as biodiversity, and ideas of democracy and social access to space. This is, of course, a model of Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, where landscape is actually integrated with the city. It becomes a kind of landscape urbanism, if you will, a city where green space is about parks and gardens, but it's also about spaces for the provision of food, spaces for water management, spaces for biodiversification, and some of them are small, and some of them are medium, and some of them are massive in terms of the functioning and the character of the city. And of course, with the rise of environmental issues at a global scale over the years, these sorts of thematics become super prevalent. The world now, or the planet as a sustainable ecosystem, urbanism as something that isn't only about making nice places to live, but also about making places that are more efficient and more responsible with regards to resources and food. People like Richard Burdett, writing books like The Endless City, absolutely paranoid about the metrics or the quantities or the numbers involved with population growth. So if in 1900 the world's population 10% of that population lived in the cities, that's about 2 billion people, projected in 2050, which isn't so long away, to be 10 billion people living in cities. 75% of the world's population concentrated in cities. Now think about the kinds of pressures that cities have in terms of being able to accommodate those numbers of people, being able to make sure that there's clean water, food. One of the biggest issues facing the world will not only be the diminishing resources of oil and carbon, but also water, air quality, and the provision of arable land or agricultural land for food. So these are big issues, and they go beyond the sentimentality or the nostalgia for nice places. It becomes a more fundamental task of beginning to restructure and reorganize how we think of the city. So I wanted to talk about this idea of the shared city, creativity and design in terms of contributing to how we think about and make the shared city along three axes of thought. One is the idea of organization, how we organize the city, and especially how we organize it in terms of resources and space. Secondly is the political dimension and how we ensure that there's democratic participation in how we think about making public spaces. And finally is just the delight and the pleasure of social space, making spaces for people that are attractive and inspiring and compelling and promote the city as a place to live. These are some, on this first topic of organization, these are some maps made by Buckminster Fuller, where he unfolds the surface of the globe in a variety of different map formats. And each map has a completely different ideological and operational content in terms of how the world could operate. Whether it is a stratosphere strategic configuration, a one ocean configuration, or a one continent configuration. So this idea of how you organize geopolitical and environmental and urban space has a lot of interest to me in terms of having organizational creativity in terms of how things work. This diagram I'm very keen of too. It shows the organizational structures. It's a little bit of humor and tongue-in-cheek built in here too. But various organizational structures of tech companies. So you can see in the case of Apple, for example, the absolute centrality of the boss and all of the various reports to the boss in a sort of non-hierarchical open system. And you compare that or contrast that to Microsoft, which is drawn here as there's a boss, but there's also 3 or 4 balkanized groups who just don't speak to one another. That's the software group and the hardware group and the marketing group, all doing their own thing and actually pointing guns at one another. You look at the system of Amazon with a very clear hierarchical system, but compare that to Google, which has a very loose hierarchical organization with a guy at the top, but really a lot of permeability or porosity or exchange, open exchange amongst the various members. How we organize cities and how we organize space, whether we do that through grids or axes or loose accretive geometries of organization, these all have massive impact and sets of effects in terms of how the city is shared, how we share it, how we move around it, how we interact, and what sorts of relationships we have. I'm a big fan of the grid. Coming from the United States, of course, the entire country was founded as a US survey grid. Manhattan is founded on a rectangular grid. But the grid is really the penultimate geometry of democracy, because it really allows for a very open and fluid system of development over time. In this city in China, a city for 2 million people, being built now, supposedly will be fully occupied and developed by 2025. That's 10 years to develop or build a city for 2 million people. It's built on reclaimed land. This is land that was built into this coastal part of Shenzhen on the Pearl Delta. And this is our master plan for the city. It's organized around these 5 green fingers. The fingers are intended to be massive parks, 5 parks at the scale of New York Central Park, each one. But instead of only being parks with green spaces and lawns and meadows and woodland, these green fingers also capture all of the stormwater in the city and process all of that stormwater in terms of retaining it, filtering it through a series of terraces and taking it out into the bay. Also, the grid structure that then structures the 5 neighborhoods or the 5 segments of the city around these fingers is organized around a reduced block structure with a finer grain of streets and alleyways, and a transit loop connects all of the city together. It's a simple sort of urban diagram, but it allows for this rapid fire pace of development. But here, landscape is taking a major organizing role in terms of shaping the city, and processing the water and working with various aspects of how that city will be built up. This is a diagram from a book that shows the sort of sustainability matrix for that city around 3 organizational ideas. The idea of the scenic city, the livable city, and the sustainability city. And sustainability here is measured not only in terms of water and green networks and air and natural resources, but also in terms of neighborhood scale and how recycling operations work and how waste is dealt with and how energy is provided, all in a very smart and highly organized and highly structured way. This is a diagram from a planning study we made for the Rotterdam Biennale, which really has to do with how to reorganize certain parts of Rotterdam to deal better with infrastructure and waste, to take various components of the city to create new spaces that lend a new metabolism and a new organizing framework to the city. This is a landfill just outside of New York, a waste landfill. Apparently the world's largest landfill is where Manhattan and New York took all of the trash for 50 years to build these garbage mounds. It's called Fresh Kills Landscape. And this is a project that's trying to reorganize a highly engineered, highly contaminated technological post-industrial landscape at a massive scale, and trying to transform that into a new public parkland over a 25-year horizon in terms of how that new landscape is made, cultivated, managed, and curated over time to produce the impression of nature, but even though it's a highly engineered technological form of nature with a variety of social spaces. The Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, of which there were various authors, including A.E. Comm and Hargraves Associates and many others. But what's interesting about the London Olympic Park is that it was a very derelict, rundown part of East London. There was nothing happening here. It was toxic, contaminated, post-industrial land, very poor infrastructure, difficult to get to. Nothing was happening in terms of economic development and economic investment. The London Olympic bid was a huge effort to try to harness billions of dollars to transform this landscape into a new working landscape. The games, of course, only last a month or two, So what was very important about the planning and the organization of this project was what would happen after the Games. And the centerpiece of the London Olympic Park is a park, a green space oriented around these canals and rivers. Once the Games are over, the park becomes a important social space, and new economic development with new housing and commercial development happens around those spaces. But this is a good example where parks and green space and infrastructure comes first as a lever or as a catalyst for economic development to follow. So those projects all have to do with attitudes towards organization and transformation to try to harness all the different resources and amenities of a city to move it forward into the future. A second challenge for the shared city is, of course, democracy. Dealing with people, and lots of different people who have a vested interest in the project, whatever it is. This is a diagram we made to sort of capture the various voices surrounding the Seattle Central Waterfront project. These various groups, the shippers and the builders, the commuters, the greens, the visitors, the tribes, the neighbors, the sports teams, the business owners, etc. All these people have significant vested interests. They don't necessarily like one another. They argue and debate. For example, the shippers and the builders just want the new waterfront to be a big street with no traffic lights so that they can move and ship their goods as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible. The business owners want to ensure that they have commercially successful building fronts. The neighbors don't really want too much to change. They sort of like it as it is and they're fearful of change. The visitors who are coming to Seattle want to have a waterfront that has various touristic and interpretive appeal, etc. So these projects are very complicated because as a designer, we don't work anymore for kings or for presidents or for mayors. We work for a community that's often diverse and divergent in its interests. So these projects are political, and the shared city is about taking on the politics of participation and the politics of community. This is the Seattle waterfront, and you see the freeway. It's a double-deck freeway running through the center of the waterfront, now being demolished and rerouted through the city in a tunnel. And at the same time, the seawall that holds the city back is being restored because of significant earthquake damage to that seawall. The plan is quite complicated and has very many components to it. It's an urban planning diagram with a lot of components. But one component I thought I'd touch on is something that you will probably never see. It's this small pink wall in this diagram. This is a seawall. It's the building of the new seawall, and the building up underneath that seawall of a new ledge for a baby salmon to be able to migrate from the south to the north, which is a very important migratory corridor for the baby salmon. This is one small ingredient in this sort of social, political matrix around this waterfront, something that you will probably not see. But the seawall becomes an important device not only for earthquake prevention, but also for establishing new habitat for the salmon. And then the seawall itself, we designed it as a sort of texture in an effort to ensure that this texture will capture as many different forms of algae and rockfish that are important habitat features for the migrating salmon. Here are these massive, big chunks of seawall being installed. And then above the seawall is what's called a light penetrating surface. This is a surface with glass block to ensure that light is let down to the fish corridor below. And it creates, therefore, a distinctive impression on the promenade. And from below, this is what you won't really see, is all of the investment and time that went into the ledge for the aquatic corridor, the seawall, and the light penetrating surface. So even though it's such a big and massive project, it's actually, many of its components are hidden. A third project that is about democracy and participation is in Santa Monica, involving Native American Indians that used to live in this location but were since long displaced, with a fairly extensive public outreach program and participatory program. This is the site in the heart of Santa Monica, 10 acres of old parking asphalt and concrete, and now transformed into a new green park that has a lot of connective pathways that connect the neighborhood to the beach and to the city. And you can see the grain of this park now becoming a very interconnected system, connecting back to the city. It has a name. There's a variety of topographic features that allow you to change level in the park, a series of viewing pavilions from the hilltops. So these hills that have been carefully designed and made allow you to get to a raised elevation where you get great views out across the street to the sunset across the ocean and over to the beach. And they become quite iconic or gateway-like in terms of how they mark the definition of the park and allow for a variety of other spaces and other installations that make the park not only beautiful but fulfilling in terms of the various social, political dimensions that were required of this park from all of the different community groups and all of the different people that were part of the participatory action. And finally, this project in San Francisco, it's where the Presidio, which is a historical landscape, meets the bay in San Francisco. They're building these tunnels. You see these white tunnels here are going to take the freeway underneath the tunnels and open up this landscape now as a new public park. As a public park, when you get out onto those tunnel tops, you will see a full 360-degree panorama. And we call this a sort of democratic platform. It's a platform where everybody from the city will be invited. And when you are there, you will be able to see every horizon of the city. It becomes symbolic of democracy in San Francisco. And here you see the new park built out over those tunnel tops, connecting these spaces, but also creating great new places for viewing, for vista, and for celebrating the whole idea of being in nature in the context of the city. And finally, this brings me to my third theme, which is really the social. So on the one hand, the shared city is an organizational issue. On the second, it's a sort of political, participatory issue. And thirdly, it's social. It's really about making social space for people. And of course, the High Line is widely recognized on many levels, economic, preservation, etc. But the highlight of the High Line is really its social dimension. The High Line was built over what used to be a very congested street with freight and industry on the west side of Manhattan. It was built as a steel structure which raised the train tracks above the street 30 feet or 10 meters above the street. When the train stopped running, birds dropped seed, and a natural meadow grew up by accident. And nobody knew this green ribbon was there. It was like a secret. and people only perceived the High Line to be a negative piece of derelict infrastructure and wished that it could be pulled down and removed altogether. Nobody knew there was this secret magical green garden on the top. And this green ribbon runs all the way through the west side of Manhattan for 1.5 miles in a very sort of secretive and hidden and magical way. As part of an economic development initiative, Mayor Bloomberg took the west side of Manhattan as something that had a lot of economic development potential. He ran a new subway line to feed this part of the city with new transportation. And he rezoned the entire district so that the new zoning allowed for, that's something wrong with that slide, but the new zoning allowed for the transference of development rights to the avenues. So developers could build bigger and taller buildings along the avenues, preserving space around the High Line. From a design point of view, we were very struck by the poetry of what we found on the High Line. We found this strange, quiet, serene piece of nature that was secret and nobody knew was there. And this piece of nature ran for 1 mile quietly through the city. It did so on a structure of concrete and steel that from the street looked pretty industrial and foreboding, but it still has its own interest with the rivets and the way in which it's made. And then on the top was this beautiful natural meadow that was a secret and was very quiet and very strange in juxtaposition to the buildings and the streets around it. The meadow grew originally because the wood sleepers accumulated moisture, and that they formed the initial soil, if you will, for seeds to take root, getting moisture and nutrition from the wood sleepers. The more the plants grew and then they died, their organic material began to form soil, and that's when you began to get almost a total meadow from side to side. The tracks were still there, floating through that meadow with amazing views and vistas across the city. Success of the High Line is really how it's used. I remember in some early design meetings, the client would always ask, will anybody come? Why will somebody climb 10 meters into the sky, upstairs or elevators? Why will anybody go up there? And when they are up there, why will they stay? So, in many ways, what has surprised me and surprised everybody is the sheer numbers of people that go up onto the High Line and the range of social activities that you see that are extremely participatory and engaging and fun and delightful. And you take a bunch of New Yorkers who normally aren't that interested in public space necessarily because they're busy. They go to their apartments to sleep and shower and then to go to work, actually now using the High Line as a space of social interaction and social engagement. It's a space where people come to be seen. They think it's cool for people to see them, but it's also really cool to see other people and to be in this field of interaction and engagement. And finally, there's a quote I was going to end with by a political theorist, Benjamin Barber, who's describing the importance of public space in the city for democracy. He describes public space as perhaps the most important component of any democracy. Public space is where people come together, where people of like mind and unlike mind come together. It's where you have friction, it's where you have tension, it's also where you have delight and pleasure and joy. It's what makes cities great for humans who are essentially social animals who want to be with other people in the context of the city. These spaces are super important, and yet they're so under threat. They're under threat from commercial development, where there are only solely commercial interests. They're under threat because of a certain fear of public space, that public space invites unwanted or unwelcome types of people. They're under threat because of surveillance and regimes of control. They're under threat because of costs and logistics in terms of just simply being able to maintain and program them. But to go back to my remarks at the beginning, imagine what Prague would be without its public spaces. And imagine what London or Paris or New York City would be without their public spaces. So we all must continue to work hard to ensure that investment and care is taken in terms of how we make spaces in the shared city. Thank you very much.